Hello! In this video we will look at Houdini Animation Editor and how it works. First we will start with the basics such as what are scope parameters, how to deal with keys, edit tangents and slopes, and in part 2 we will cover features such as animation layers, channel groups, dope sheet and some other cool features as well. With that, let's start with the basics by creating a bouncing ball. So here we have a ball in the scene, and let's create a few keyframes so that the ball will bounce from left to right. And let's start going to frame 1, select our ball and set the first keyframe on translate text by Alt and left mouse click on the parameter, and this will set the keyframe at the first frame. Then let's move to the last frame and move the ball to the right. And if you have the auto key enabled, this will automatically set the keyframe at the current frame. If you don't have the auto key enabled, we can just press Alt and left click on the parameter again, and we will have two keyframes at frame 1 and frame 100. Now if we play an animation, we can see that the animation is playing back quite fast, and this is because we don't have the real-time playback enabled. And we can change that if we go into global animation options here and just turn on real-time playback. Now if we play our animation again, it is playing in real time. So now let's add some bounce animation to our ball, and for this we'll just key the translate Y, and let's start up here, and then let's go a few frames forward and move the ball down. Just put it on the ground, and then again forward, move it up, forward, back to the ground, and forward, something like this. And let's move forward. And some small bounces at the end. So here, let's play this. Okay, so now we have some basic keyframes set, but as you can see, the animation at this point is really mechanical and floaty, and so we will have to make a few corrections. For that, we will have to go into the animation editor. And as you can see, there's a lot of options all over the place, and it might look a bit intimidating at first. So the animation editor is split into different regions, if you will. On the left, we have the channel list and animation layers. We also have the channel groups here, and all this can be also in the separate channel list panel. So for now, we'll just focus on these parameter sheets in the channel list. So we'll just hide the animation layers and the channel groups. So if you look at the toolbar, here we have the tools that are used for editing keys and tangents mostly. On the right, we have a toolbar which deals with display and how things are displayed in the graph view here. And at the bottom we have fields where we can manually enter keyframe values, frames, slopes, and functions. And we also have a lot of other options and tools in the menu here as well. Now, this might look like a lot of tools, but honestly, even with a character with hundreds of controls, we rarely touch all the tools and options. But now let's go back to our ball animation. So first let's see how to get parameters here in the channel list. One way, as we already saw, if we select the object that it's animated, its parameters will be loaded here in the channel list. There's also another way. For instance, we can shift and left mouse click to get the parameter into the channel list. And we can also shift and middle click, and this will add the parameter to the channel list. And we can also change which parameters are added automatically by changing the parameters auto add flag. We can do that by right clicking on the parameter, go into channels and change the auto add flag. So for instance, right now, when we select the ball, all the parameters with auto add flag are added. And for instance, here we have scale, which we will not animate, and we can just go into channels, toggle the auto add flag, and when we next time select the ball, the scale will not be automatically added. Of course, we can still shift and middle click on the scale and add it manually. You should also note that when we add parameters here to channel list, we are basically telling that these parameters are scoped. And scope parameters are basically just parameters that we are currently working on. We can see the keyframes here of the scope parameters. All the channels here or parameters shown here are basically scope parameters. And this means that whenever, for instance, we set this keyframe, it will set a keyframe on all scope parameters. Basically, whatever is scoped, we are working on. And we also have the what's called selected channels. And usually when we add parameters to our channel list, all the channels are selected here in the channel list, as we can see here. But we can also manually just select, for instance, translate X and translate Y. And there's a difference between scoped and selected channels. Selected, for instance, some operations will only work on selected channels, and some operations will only work on scoped channels. Usually the channels are automatically selected by default, and the scope channels are also selected channels at the same time. Just know that playbar, for instance, will always show scope channels keyframes, and graph view here will show the selected channels. And some operations like keyframe here will always work on scope channels, so channels that are in the channel list, and we'll add keys to all those channels as we saw before. While some other operations will work with selected channels. For instance, if I Alt and left click here, it will only add keys to selected channels. We can change the channel selection by, for instance, dragging or shift click and control click each individual channel, and basically just select any channel we want. And now we can see here in the graph view all the animation curves for our ball. And right now we have only two channels animated, the translate X and translate Y. And right now we see that all the curves are nicely framed in the graph view. And if they are not, we can use the right mouse button and click and drag to zoom in and zoom out of the graph view, middle mouse button to move around, and we can use these framing icons. For instance, if you press this home icon, it will frame everything into the graph view. If we click this one, this is vertical adapt, it will frame it vertically, and this one, it will frame it horizontally. We can also use the view menu. For instance, if you want to just frame on these keyframes that we selected here, go view, frame selection, and it will frame into these selected keyframes. And to change the time range displayed in the graph view, here we have the range bar, and we can just click and drag to display a specific time range. We can also manually enter it here, for instance, to display only keyframes in the range from 5 to 50. We can manually enter the values here. And we can also use these keyframe buttons, which will move the time to next and previous key. Now let's go back to our ball animation. First, let's decide how fast we want the ball to move from left to right. And this is the translate X parameter. Now, depending what we have set as the default segment type in the animation preferences, here in the initial segment section, we might have by default this curve as smooth or stepped or straight. And we can change this curve function by changing the tangent type to constant, linear, cubic, or Bezier. We can also change it here in the function field. So depending what we want initially, this will set, but can be changed here. Now, before directly changing the tangent for the translate X, we can change the value and time at which the ball arrives at the destination. To do that, we can just click on the keyframe, and for instance, for frame 100, and slide it up and down to change the value, or left and right to change the time at which it arrives. We can also do both at the same time. So right now, if we click on this diamond icon, it will, or the box icon, it will only change values. And this stick will change, this vertical bar will change the time. But if we control drag, we can do both at the same time. We can also enable it here with value time mark handles, and this will also allow to change both time and value at the same time. Since we want our ball to slowly slow down towards the right now we have this S curve, and this S curve basically tells us that in X direction the ball is speeding up towards the middle and slows down towards the end again. To change that, we can just go to first frame, select the keyframe, select this tangent handle, and this will change the slope of this first keyframe, and we simply drag this tangent, and if we control drag, it will lock the angle at which we are changing the tangent value. And we can go then to the last keyframe, select this tangent, and control drag to keep the angle, or drag this tangent however you want. And now if we play, the ball is slowing down in the X direction. Now let's look at the translate Y, and we want to change so that the bounce is not so floaty. And what we want is that when the ball is bouncing at here, when it bounces down, we want this angle to be more sharp here. And right now we can see that if we change in the one tangent, the tangent on the other side is also affected. And this is because the tangents are tied. And we want to edit them independently. And we can do that by selecting this, the whole keyframe, and this icon here will untie them. So here untie handles, and now we can see that this tangent line has become dotted, and this tells that we can edit them independently. So right now, if we move this tangent here, this one stays the same, and we can do the same for this tangent. And also notice that the length of the tangent is staying the same, and this is because we have keep acceleration ratio enabled. If we disable this, we can edit each tangent completely separately, and the ratio between in and out tangent is not staying the same. If we enable it again, the ratio of the in and out tangent is staying the same. We are only changing the angle of each tangent independently. And if you want to tie the handles back, we can just click the tie handle icon, and this will tie the handles back. Now let's see how this bounce works. Okay, it works better, but these bounces don't work here. But for starters, we can just copy this keyframe and paste it on all these keyframes. To do that, we can just select this keyframe and press Ctrl C or copy in the menu. I'm going to this keyframe here, paste it, this one here, paste it, here, and here, and here. Notice that tangent here is a bit too much because the bounce is lower. So we will just Control drag and lower some of these tangents. Now let's see how the animation works. Okay, it's a little better. And now we also want the ball to stay longer when it is at its highest point. And we can just select the keyframe tangent and just drag for each bounce. We can also bounce it higher and dragging the tangent. For each keyframe, and look how it works now. Okay, this works much better. Now another thing here is that, for instance, when we have a tangent at an angle like this, and we just want to flatten it, we can just select the keyframe, right click, and set selected slopes to 0. And this will flatten the curve. Another option is also by using automatic slopes. So if you click select selected slopes to automatic, note that the icon changed to this diamond shape icon, and the regular manual keys have these box shape icons. And the difference between a manual and automatic slopes is that automatic slopes adjust the angle of these tangents automatically depending on the slope around them or the keyframes around them. So if we add a key here by Alt and left clicking on the curve and change the keyframe up, notice that this slope now changed from flat to this angle because it is automatic. And if we change it back, selected slope to manual and move this key down, it didn't change this angle. And that is the difference between manual and automatic slopes. So let's just delete this key and 0 the slope. Now let's say that we are satisfied with the way ball bounces, but we would only want that all bounces would be higher or lower. And we can do this by simply dragging each key separately. We can also select all the keys and use this value field in saying that we want to multiply them by 1.5. 1.1, which will tell the ball to bounce 10% higher. And what we can also do is select all the keyframes and use this box handle. And the box handle is basically allowing us to scale the key in the box as far as values goes, or we can stretch them to retime them. So for instance, if we like this, we see the ball will start bouncing very fast. Or if we stretch them here, it will bounce slowly. So multiple ways. The box is very useful for exactly such things when we want to apply such transformations to a set of keys. Basically, it's like a lattice for keyframes. And as we saw, you can also use the fields below, and you can just for instance, select these keys and middle mouse button, click and drag to change the values. And for instance, offset them in time by changing the frame values. We can also multiply or add values by, for instance, if we want to add value, we can type +5, and this will change all the key values for the value of 5. If you want to add the negative value or move it in frames back, we can type ±10, for instance, and this will move the keys back. Sometimes we are not sure if the changes will work out and we want to keep the old curve and compare it with the new one. And this is when the snapshots come in. Snapshot is basically a copy of the animation curve, and we can swap the current curve with the snapshot curve if we want to. So let's say that in our case we want a ball bounce on frame 30 higher, but we are unsure whether or not this will be better or worse. We can store the original translate Y curve and edit a new curve, and then we will compare which one we like better. First, we have to enable snapshots, and we can do them in the menu, here snapshots, and enable channel snapshots, or here in the sidebar menu. When we enable them and move this keyframe up, we see there's a darker curve staying where we made the snapshot. So this is the old curve, and we are editing the new curve. And if we are unsure, or let's say that we want to swap this snapshot back, we can always just go to snapshots and say swap active channels and snapshots. And this will swap these two curves. So right now we have the ball jumping higher, and if we simply swap it, we go back to the original curve. We can always create a new snapshot. We just clear the channel snapshot, and then a new snapshot has been created at the new position, and now we are able to swap between this new position and the one we are editing. So let's disable the snapshots for now, go to translate X, and let's say we want to add some keys to translate X animation. If we have the auto key enabled here, then we can simply move the object around in translate X, and the key will be created automatically. What we can also do is, as we did before, simply Alt and left click on the parameter, and a new keyframe is created here, or we can Alt and left click anywhere on the curve, and a new keyframe will be created at that position and frame. Just note that the difference we mentioned between scoped and selected channels, that if you press the key button here, it will key all scoped channels, not just the selected one that we see here in the viewport. I would also suggest to get used to using hotkeys, as the workflow will be much faster than clicking on the key button every time. And another quick tip for setting keyframes: if we press Alt and left click, it will add key to all selected channels. However, if we press Shift and Alt and left click, it will only add it to the curve on which we clicked. So Shift, Alt and left click, and the key will be only added to the curve under the cursor. Notice that when we are adding new keys, the new keys are changing the slope of the existing curve, since the slope is automatically calculated when we add new keys. So for instance, let's say that we have something like this, and then we add a new key somewhere here, and as you can see, we changed the curvature of the curve when this key was added. We can change this by going to settings and toggle the auto slope mode preference. And now when we add a new key. The tangent of this new key will be added and set in a way that it will not change the curvature or the slope of the existing curve. And this is a very useful feature when we already modify the tangents and the curves are working, but we just need a few more keyframes and keep everything else. Notice that all the keyframes here are colored as the color of the animation curve. However, if I disable this snap moved keys to nearest frame and add a few keyframes, notice that these keys are now colored white. And this indicates that the keys are set between the frames. So it's not on a full frame like 63, but 63.13. So it's not on a full frame. This option, snap moved keys to nearest frame, that is making sure that when we move keys around, it moves them to the full integer value frame. And if we disable this, we can move them between the frames, and this also means when adding keys. So if we have this enabled and add keys, you'll see the values of this keyframe is always on a full frame, so it's not between the frames. So this is a difference, and it's easy to notice because the keys are colored white, and we can just enable the snap to nearest frame and select the keys, move them left or right, and they will snap to the nearest frame. One more thing about the timeline is a feature that I find sometimes useful, and that is middle dragging the time slider. So let's show both these curves and middle drag these time sliders, for instance, here. And notice that nothing changed in the viewport, but there are a few yellow boxes here in the graph view. What this effectively does is it is indicating where the keys will be set if we set the keys. So we are basically copying values from the time we started dragging from. So it's a cool feature when all you want is set the same value at different time. So if I now Alt and left click, it will set keys at those values, which are the same values that were at the frame we started dragging from. So that's it for part 1, in which we covered the basics, and in part 2 we are going to take a look at a more complex example and the rest of the tools found in the animation editor.